I'm frankly looking forward to returning to living a life that enjoys a lot of simple pleasures and gives me time for family and friends.
Marco is joining an elite group of past recipients for this award. 2 of us so far. I'll see you at the reunion dinner, table for 2. You know any good diners in New Hampshire or Iowa?
Paul, thank you for your invitation for lunch in Iowa and New Hampshire. But I will not stand by and watch the people of South Carolina ignored.
The joking and the jockeying have already begun for 2016. We're going to do that in a little bit with our roundtable. Let me reintroduce everyone. George Will, Paul Krugman of the New York Times, Matthew Dowd, James Carville, and Mary Matalin. I do want to get to that, George. But first, some big news out of the Supreme Court on Friday. They took up 2 big gay marriage cases, one on the Defense of Marriage Act, which denies federal benefits to couples that are legally married in various states. But perhaps more interestingly, they took up the Proposition 8 case, which banned gay marriage in California, which at least leaves open the possibility that they get to the underlying question whether gay marriage is a guaranteed right under the Constitution.
As part of equal protection. Peter Finley Dunn, great American humorist, created a man named Mr. Dooley, who famously said, the Supreme Court follows the election returns. This decision by the Supreme Court came 31 days after an election day in which 3 states, for the first time, endorsed same-sex marriage at the ballot box. Never happened before. Maine, Maryland, and the state of Washington. Now, the question is, how will that influence the court? It could make them say, it's not necessary for us to go here. They don't want to do what they did with abortion. The country was having a constructive accommodation on abortion, liberalizing abortion laws. The court yanked the subject out of democratic discourse and embittered the argument. They may say, we don't want to do that. We can just let the democracy take care of this. On the other hand, they could say it's now safe to look at this because there is something like an emerging consensus. Quite literally, the opposition to gay marriage is dying. It's old people.
That is true. At the same time, James Carville, right now at least, and this might argue for the split the difference position that George talked about, 41 states still outlaw gay marriage.
Yeah, I think George is right. It depends on whether they're going to go, to allow this to happen. But I mean, his larger point is absolutely correct. The election just matters in profound ways that we can't believe. Look in Salt Lake City, the 12 apostles. The Mormon Church, after the election, says, well, maybe we're going to change our position, and homosexuality is a choice. You're not born that way. I mean, the effects of an election reverberate all the way through society. And this is just one of these that did. I cannot believe that they took this up. The fact that they took it up just tells me instinctively that they're going to propose some of these things. And
Mary, not just the election. We see it. The trend has been pretty clear here over the last dozen years. I want to show this Pew poll shows right now. Back in 2001, 57% of the country opposed gay marriage. Only 35% were for. This year, it's crossed. The lines have crossed. 48%, approaching, going above 50. 48% now support gay marriage in the country.
Right. Well, because Americans have common sense. There are important constitutional, biological, theological, ontological questions relative to homosexual marriage. But people who live in the real world say the greater threat to a civil order is heterosexuals who don't get married and are making babies. That's an epidemic and crisis proportions. That is irrefutably more problematic for our culture than homosexuals getting married. So I find this an important dancing on the head of a pin argument, but in real life, looking down 30 years from now, real people understand the consequences of so many babies being born out of wedlock to the economy and to the morality.
By the way, that chart, I don't know why they highlighted 2001, because it was actually a wider gap in 2004. And gay marriage was a losing thing for Democrats in 2004, and it's now a winning thing. That's amazing. 8 years, this country has changed.
Winning. So you think it's beyond neutral? You think it's winning?
I think it's actually a positive, because this is a significant block of voters that will make a decision based on which party they see as being favorable to equal rights here.
Yeah. To me, this is the consensus has already really emerged on this issue. It's just a question of if the Supreme Court going to catch up and follow that wind in the path,
or get ahead of it,
or put a block in the path of it. I mean, if you take a look at this, there is still a division in this country over this issue, but there is no division in this country among people under 35 or 30 years old on this issue. There is no division. I have a perfect example. My son went in the Army. They asked him 10 years before. They'd asked everybody to raise their hands. 300 guys raised their hand. Who's for gays in the military? 80% of the troops said we're opposed to gays in the military. When he got in 5 or 6 years later, 80% said they were for gays in the military. It had changed that much and that quick. To me, you still have to, though, there's a huge group of folks in this country that believe this issue is not ready to be settled nationally in this. And they're over 35. They go to church regularly. They still view marriage as traditional and all that. But in the end, this issue, 5 years from now, is even going to be more settled. 10 years from now, it's going to be more settled.
Interestingly, George, well, that is still the president's position. Even when he came out in support of gay marriage, he didn't come out for a complete federal solution. He was saying, and he didn't say that it was a right guaranteed by the Constitution. He said, let the states continue to decide this.
Well, marriage law is traditionally the prerogative of the states, but let's put a human face on this. One of the two cases concerns a New York woman who married in Canada, her female partner. They lived together 44 years. The partner dies. Because the partner wasn't a man, the woman is hit with a $363,000 tax bill from the federal government. There are 1,000 or more federal laws or programs that are at stake here. And the more the welfare state envelops us in regulations and benefits, the more the equal protection argument weighs in and may be decided.
It's hard to see how the Supreme Court is going to allow the Defense of Marriage Act to continue to deny those benefits. Let's move on right now. A surprise in Washington this week, something of a surprise. Senator Jim DeMint, South Carolina conservative of South Carolina, left the Senate to become the head of the Heritage Foundation. Ended up having created a big debate over does he have more influence inside or outside the Senate. He had this colloquy with Rush Limbaugh.
I believe that I can do more good for the conservative movement outside of the Senate.
Well, I think it's safe to say Boehner is not forcing either of you guys out, right?
That's pretty true.
It might work a little bit the other way, Rush.
All right.
That was Ed Follner, the current head of the Heritage Foundation, Mary Matalin. So do you think DeMint made the right choice if he wants to have more influence?
Yes, absolutely. As our hero Keynes once said, ideas drive history. Ideas drive progress. And Heritage has long been the font of so many great ideas. And they're respected and they're cutting edge. We find in Congress, all of us who've worked in Congress or the White House, it's a laborious piecemeal process. These guys have big ideas and they have big frameworks. And he, as a conservative, as a constitutionalist, that was a brilliant move, a good move for us, a brilliant move for him. And it also leaves Nikki Haley, Governor Haley, an opportunity to fulfill her legacy, her vision of real legislative reform and real economic reform by appointing somebody like Tim Scott in his place.
Become the first African-American, the only African-American in the Senate right now, and the only African-American Republican.
The actual Keynes quote is, he said that it's ideas which are dangerous for good or evil. I guess I got a view in this case. But the thing, I'm more interested in what does this do to Heritage? I mean, this is somebody who has no sense that he's a researcher, an academic, anything like that. This is sort of taking the think out of the think tank, right? This is turning into a purely political institution.
Putting the polemics into your...
Well, there we are.
George, you were there at the beginning, sort of, with the Heritage Foundation.
It is the established myth at Heritage that 40 years ago this year, I was crucial to establishing Heritage because I was working for Senator Gordon Allott, a Republican from Colorado, and a letter came from Joe Coors, very generous to conservative causes, the beer family in Colorado. And he said, I've got $250,000 and I want to do something to disseminate conservative ideas. I was out of the office that day, which is a good thing because I wouldn't have known what to do with it. Instead, it went to Gordon Allott's press secretary, a young man named Paul Wyrick, who knew exactly what to do with it, got Ed Follner, and a few years later, they opened the Heritage Foundation. This was an important part of conservatism building an alternative intellectual infrastructure. Liberals have the media, they have academia, they've got Hollywood. Conservatives said, let's build our own.
Meanwhile, right now, James, it seems like parts of that infrastructure are turning on each other.
Yeah, it is. But the interesting part of the infrastructure, I thought, is when Dick Armey left the Tea Party of Freedom Works, he had an $8 million severance package. I mean, I've been in the wrong business. I mean, nobody has an $8 million severance package. And at the same time, Senator DeMint, who is not, by the way, ever been thought of as a big think guy. This is a guy who thought that unmarried school teachers, if you were unmarried and living with somebody, you shouldn't be able to teach at schools. I mean, this is what we're dealing with.
But he did have big influence in the Senate.
He had big influence. I mean, he was not a big idea guy. He was a very gutsy guy, and you're not a big idea man if you're for Christine O'Donnell or Sharon Angle. But he was gutsy. I'll give him that.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Two things. First thing, his biggest influence was keeping the Democrats in the majority in the Senate, which is when his backed candidates basically didn't allow Republicans to win in certain campaigns. But let me just make a bigger point. I think this is actually a very sad commentary on our politics today, because here you have a guy that was a well-established U.S. senator with tremendous amount of experience in a deliberative body that was supposed to be respected in the world. He leaves that deliberative body as a U.S. senator and now becomes the head of a think tank, or whatever way we describe it. It is, I think, epidemic in our political. We now have campaign people who used to love to work for presidential campaigns that now think their best route to success is working for super PACs. And so as we keep stepping further and further away, and people's success in politics is now no longer viewed as, I'm going to hold office and I'm going to do something good, they now think they can't do that anymore in Washington holding the office. They now have to leave in order to have more influence in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, but it's partly the extreme partisanship. I mean, all that really matters for the most part in Congress is whether you've got an R or a D after your name. And since DeMint is going to be replaced by somebody else with an R after his name, he can have a lot more influence by moving off to this think tank, and of course increase his salary by 400%.
Meanwhile, there has been this real debate over where the Republicans go after the election, what the Republican vision should be. And there were two serious speeches this week by Paul Ryan and Marco Rubio at the American Enterprise Institute where they took on that challenge.
Both parties tend to divide Americans into our voters and their voters. Let's be really clear. Republicans must steer far clear of that trap.
I've heard it suggested that the problem is that the American people have changed, that too many people want things from government. But I'm still convinced that the overwhelming majority of our people, they just want what my parents had, a chance.
George Will, I think Marco Rubio used the phrase, term middle class more than 24 times in that speech.
Yeah. Usually the forgotten middle class, and it's all we talk about is the forgotten middle class. The Republicans' problem is the national problem, and it's the one James was talking about, the sense of stagnation among Americans who are not on the ladder of upward mobility right now, the widening disparities, health care costs, and the cost of that which puts you on the ladder, the cost of college. In about 4 or 5 weeks, we are going to pass a milestone where we will have $1 trillion of student debt. That's more than credit card debt in this country. 2/3 of kids leave college with student debt, average $29,000 a person. They're graduating from college with a mortgage already. How are they going to buy houses, form families, and all the rest? That's what the
One of the big ideas Marco Rubio was talking about there, though, was making sure that there was a lot more transparency as kids are taking out those loans.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, I wouldn't have said there were any big ideas. I thought that was really striking about both speeches was that they were both saying we need to reach out to lower income working Americans. And the way we do that is by explaining to them really carefully that tax cuts for the rich are actually good for them. I mean, there were no substantive policy changes in either speech. It was really amazing stuff. It was showing how difficult the GOP's position is.
Well, the GOP is in a very difficult position because the American country has changed, and the Republican brand and their candidates today or in the elections up until November do not match where the country is. If just fundamentally the American electorate looks much different than the Republican. Wait a sec, Mary. It looks fundamentally different than American. I think they need to stake out a ground that basically says we not only look different, we're going to say things different, and they have to, in my view, the best message they can do, which I know they're probably not going to do, is they have to run against Washington and run against Wall Street. They have to become the party of the middle class, and whether they look at Marco Rubio looks at, or Governor Christie looks different than what normally people look, their brand has to change if they're going to win elections.
We're just shaking his head, Mary.
Did you just say one of those guys don't look like normal people? That's the difference between conservatives and liberals. Ideas are dangerous for good or evil. Can I just say we're missing the reality here? The federal office holders are not the entirety of our government. We have governors, we have legislators, we have mayors who are making progress in all kinds of states, and all kinds of different people are stepping up to run for office. And Rubio and Ryan are very deep in policy, and they're the policies that have been reflected in huge successes in Indiana and in Wisconsin and across the country and everywhere where Republicans are hold the majorities at the governorship level.
George, it was an interesting week. They gave 2 speeches to the Kemp thing. They were speeches. They were written, and they were nice-looking guys. We say they take a good shower. They had a vote. And it was a treaty that Dick Thornburgh negotiated, that Bush pushed through, that everybody was about how you treat disabled people around the world. It was non-enforceable. It was the most innocuous thing ever. And they bring Dowd down to Florida House, and somebody says, no, if you pass this, they're going to break into your house and you're not be able to homeschool your kid unless you have a ramp. 36 Republicans, out of fear that they're going to get primaried, vote against this. This is where the rubber meets the road. They can give a speech, but when it comes time to vote, and the same thing comes back, and they're going to need to break out of it. I thought the vote was the most illustrative thing of the week.
Just as an example of how the country is, as Mary suggests, mixed in its views right now. Next week, Michigan, the 5th highest unionization rate, and not coincidentally, the 5th highest unemployment rate in the country, may become the 24th right-to-work state, the 2nd in the industrial Midwest after Indiana. That tells you that the country is in a more interesting ferment. My suggestion, Matt, Wall Street, Main Street, and all the rest, I will know the Republican Party is on the way back when they have the good sense to come out for breaking up the largest banks.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely
good policy. And an excellent thing to do.
I'm not sure whether the GOP sold its soul to Wall Street or vice versa in this last election, but there was clearly Wall Street tended to be relatively Democratic in the past, and now it is that close to the Republican Party.
We'll see. At least some conservatives calling for it right now. We'll see. Meanwhile, at the same time, we've got front page of the New York Times this morning. I guess it is never too early. Look at it right here. Hillary Clinton, 2016. That's all her choices hinge on that. And we also did a poll at ABC News this week. Pretty remarkable poll. It said that 57% of the country right now would actually support Hillary Clinton for president. James Carville, of course, you worked closely with her for many, many years. I think it's safe to say that no one knows what she's going to do. But the point of the New York Times is right, though. She has every decision she makes now, she has to look at it through the prism of that bigger decision, right?
Since 1944, if we would have been sitting here, Republicans have always craved order, and they've always looked for a line to get behind. We've always been people that we want to fall in love. We're looking for the next argument. This is entirely different. Every Democrat I know says, God, I hope she runs. We don't need a primary. Let's just go to post with this thing. We don't want to fight with anybody over anything. The Republicans, they need a fight. Somebody's got to beat somebody. Somebody's got to stand. Beating Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann don't count. You got to beat somebody good. You got to go through the difficult process.
You got to beat a ranked team.
Yeah, you got to beat somebody. And the Republicans know that they need a primary. We don't want a primary. We don't want to be slugging this thing out in April. You know what? We got a pretty good demographic deck. We like winning presidential elections. She's popular. Let's just go with it. And the pressure on her is going to be enormous.
Making Mary laugh over there.
Well, the idea that this just defies, I love Hillary. I wish she would run, but it defies human nature to think that Democrats, even though they are redistributionist and utopians, would not be competitive, that Warner or all these other Democrats who've been waiting in the wings are going to have a dynasty, since Democrats are always complaining about these dynasties. They're going to have another Clinton step up, and everyone's going to go, yeah, step back. I don't think so. Furthermore, the Democratic Party is split. 17% of them are extreme liberals, and then the rest of them are centrists. And the 2014 senators that are running are centrists. The ones that just got elected are centrists. So she would have to run with the country, which would alienate.
She bridges that divide right now.
Yeah, I think, that what's happened is the extreme liberals, I guess that would, I talked to a lot of those guys. They're also pragmatic. They compromised a lot on health care reform. You know, they said they wanted Medicare for all, but they were willing to take Obamacare, and they would see Hillary Clinton as someone who couldn't continue to, you know, make incremental progress towards what they want. I've never seen this much love.
I do think the interesting, I mean, the whole race in 2016 right now pivots off of her. I think that whether or not other Democrats run, it's all going to pivot off of her, and even the Republicans, to a degree, are going to pivot off what she does. To me, though, this is a moment where we are going to have a dominant woman candidate for president, whether Hillary runs or not. And if she doesn't run, another woman candidate will emerge. And I think Washington actually is in dire need of women's leadership in the Congress, because if you look at the competition and look at all the dynamics, I think this country would be served well if, whether it's Hillary or somebody else, a woman candidate emerge as a dominant force in this country.
20 women in the Senate right now.
The junior senator from New York will be that woman who is now occupying Hillary's seat, Senator Gillibrand.
And Hillary?
I have no clue, and I'm not going to think about president.
He does not want to talk about 2016.
A moratorium.
I don't know what she's going to do, but I do know this. The Democrats wanted to run. And I don't just mean a lot of Democrats. I mean a whole lot of Democrats, like 90% across the country. We just don't. We just want to win. We think she's the best person, and shut it down. And that's across the board.
And until then, it freezes the race for a long time, which is a blessing to George Will.
We need to worry about it for a while here.
We have one more round coming up.